Australia is officially one of the most expensive places to rent on the planet.
It's the highest monthly increase in almost 2 years.
Please hear me out so I could at least get this off my chest. I no longer think that it makes any financial sense for most people to buy a house.
Housing affordability is at its worst level in more than 2 decades.
Prices have increased at that rate for 25 years.
If you wanted to buy a house outright, you'd have to save 4.5 years worth of salary. Now if you want to buy a house outright, you've got to save 12 years of your salary. Well, my most recent video on the con job of the Australian government's most recent housing policy, which is designed to make it look like it's going to help young people get into the housing market, when in fact it's just going to keep the housing bubble going. I want to show why you're not going to get that out of the current crop of politicians, because they have benefited from rising house prices and they want to see that growth of house prices continue. This was said by the Australian Housing Minister in an interview on Triple J last year. Let's have a listen.
Why don't you want to be seeing house prices drop?
It's not the view of our government. We want to see sustainable price growth. We want to see more houses come online. We want to see that rental vacancy rate go up a bit, because that will relieve pressure on renters, and we certainly want to see more homeowners.
If house prices don't come down, doesn't that mean that this system is stacked against young people?
Our government's policies are not going to reduce house prices. We want house prices to grow sustainably.
Well, let's take a look at the long-term data here, because at one point the system was stacked in favour of young people, and it was stacked in favour of young people when she was young. Me too, but I didn't speculate as all the other politicians. So here we can see data going back to 1975. And by the way, if you want to use my proprietary software Ravel for economic analysis too, you get it as a free bonus inside my 7-week Ravel Economist Challenge, like over 600 people have already done. To learn more, apply at stevekeen.com. On the mean house price in Sydney and the mean income in New South Wales. And back in 1975, when Claire and all her fellow ministers and all the fellow opposition members as well were young people, the ratio of the average house price in Sydney to the average income in New South Wales was about 4.5. So if you wanted to buy a house outright, you'd have to save 4.5 years worth of salary. Now if you want to buy a house outright, you've got to save 12 years of your salary. It was in the favour of young people then. The young people then are old people now, and they want this to keep on going. Now it simply can't. You have to reduce that ratio, or you have to make it possible for people to buy despite this incredible ratio of house prices to income. I'm going to suggest 3 means by which that can be done, then I'll cover them in detail in a subsequent video. The first I call the PIL, and that stands for Property Income Limited Leverage. We should limit the amount of lending that banks can do some reasonable multiple of the rental income that a property can earn. Secondly, I'm calling the Affordable Housing Authority, and this will be a government authority that lends without charging interest, but I need to explain why that's possible. And the third, totally unlikely to happen, but it would get us out of this trap, I call a modern debt jubilee. Now, before I can explain those, I need to get some myths out of your heads, if you have them in your heads, because these myths will make my ideas sound crazy, when in fact it's the myths that are crazy and the current situation that is crazy and unsustainable. And those myths relate to how banks operate. Myths are all taught by mainstream textbooks, so politicians like Claire and I presume Anthony Albanese, though he did a degree at a university department that I helped create, so I'm rather disgusted that he hasn't learnt the world is different to what's taught by mainstream textbooks. But they all learn that banks don't actually lend money. Banks instead, in the textbook model, are what they call intermediaries, and what they do is they enable savers to lend to borrowers. Now if that was the case, then it would be quite reasonable for savers to want to receive interest, because when the savers lend to the borrowers, the savers have less money. They're doing without money to enable the borrowers to spend more. So of course the savers should get compensated with interest, and that's the model that's taught by textbooks. So let's take a look at that model. Both savers and borrowers have bank accounts at the private banks. If savers lend, then their accounts go down and the accounts of borrowers go up. If borrowers repay, then this becomes negative and goes in the opposite direction. The debt is not an asset of the bank, it's an asset of the saver. And if I run the model, you'll see that there's no change in GDP. GDP here is simply the money supply multiplied by the velocity of money. And there's no money created when you run this model. If there's no lending going on, then no change in anything, of course. But if savers lend, say, 1% of GDP, then of course their bank accounts fall and the bank account of borrowers rises. At some point you've got to stop that, otherwise the savers will run out of money completely. So let's go in the opposite direction and imagine that borrowers pay some of their debt off. Then the debt ratio falls as well and money goes back into the savers' accounts. So I've made all these radical changes to the level of credit and nothing has happened to GDP. So this is the model that sits inside the minds of most politicians, whether they're aware of it or not. And it justifies charging interest on loans because the lender is doing without something to enable the borrower to have something. Obviously you deserve compensation for that loss. But this isn't the real world. The debt is not an asset of the saver. The banks do the lending. So I can simply delete debt being shown as an asset of the saver there and delete this lending operation and say the debt is actually owned by the banks. So I do that. Now let's run the model once more. All I've changed is who we say the debt is actually owned by. And I've gone from a myth that the savers have the debt to the reality that the banks own the debt. Run the model. Nothing happens without any credit, of course, but if there is credit, then GDP rises because the extra money borrowed is actually creating money. The debt rises and so does the amount of money in the borrower's accounts. The savers are unaffected. Their money is not being lent. The bank is creating new money. And in this world, the fact that they charge interest is not because they're being compensated for doing without anything, because the banks are creating this money in the process. It's part of the business that they do, and they expect interest as part of their business mechanism. So that's the real world. And if in that world we have an increase in credit, GDP rises. If we have a fall in credit, GDP falls. You've lost the moral reason for paying interest. So we can imagine a system where there's another lender who doesn't need to be paid interest. And if that was the case, if you borrowed from that lender, the amount of money you'd pay would not include having to pay for the interest as well, and a smaller amount of money could buy a larger house. And I'll show that in the next video. But that's the first myth we need to get rid of. Now, how could you fund an organisation like that? Well, according to the textbooks, you couldn't, because the way that they show the government is much the same. They imagine the government borrows from the private sector as well. So this is now a model of the way that government finances are taught in economic textbooks. And they again teach that the banks don't actually lend money, it's the private sector that lends to the government. So what I have here is both the private sector and the government bank at private banks. If the government spends money, then it puts that money into private bank accounts, so government spending increases private bank accounts, taxation reduces it. Now, if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it's required by law to sell bonds to cover that difference, so the bonds transfer money from the private sector back to the government again, and of course the government has to pay interest on those bonds, and the rules that apply are that if the government runs a deficit, it has to sell bonds equivalent to the deficit plus interest on existing bonds. Now, this is the model that most politicians have in their heads. That means they're terrified of running a deficit, because in this model, a deficit leads to a catastrophe where government debt ends up being thousands of times GDP. So if I run it with even just a 1% of GDP deficit here, then we have debt ratios rise, and they rise exponentially. You can see the curvature turning up already. And this is only a 1% of GDP deficit. Most governments are running between 3 and 6% these days. So even with a 1% of GDP deficit, you get an enormous level of government debt over time. After 30 years, it's past 100% of GDP. If I run it for 100 years, the debt ratio will be 3,000% of GDP. The interest payments will be 1.5 times GDP. There's no way this is sustainable. At some time, the private sector would say, we're not going to lend you anymore, end of story. And that's the crisis that all the politicians today think they're avoiding by trying to reduce deficits and in fact run surpluses. Now, it's another myth. Again, it presumes that the bonds which are sold by the government to cover its operations are sold to the private sector. That's just not true. So let's just stop the model and let's rearrange things. And first of all, the bonds are not assets of the private sector. In the first instance, they're sold to the banks. Secondly, the bonds are not sold to the private sector, so we delete that operation and delete interest as well. And it's also not true that the government banks are the private bank. Governments have some accounts at private banks, but predominantly governments bank at the banks they own, which is the central bank. The government sells bonds to the private banks. It doesn't sell them to the private sector. And now let's see what happens when we have the same deficit, 1% of GDP, what actually happens. And what we get is growth in GDP, because the government spending is creating money in people's bank accounts. It's increasing reserves on the other side. You get an increase in GDP coming out of this, And the debt ratio, as you'll see, isn't going infinite, it's going to taper. In this model, because I've set the velocity of money to 2 here, it'll taper to 50% of GDP. There is no debt crisis in the real world. So it's possible for the government to create money for a range of socially useful functions. One of those could be establishing an affordable housing authority, and I'll show how that might work in future videos. This is potential ways to get it out of the crisis we're in, which is being caused by irresponsible bank lending. And in a sense, banks will fall into irresponsible lending unless the behaviour is controlled. And the simple reason is they make a profit by creating debt. So of course they're going to try to create as much debt as possible. If we go and take a look at the Australian data on that front, if we go back to the 1970s, private debt, household debt, was less than 40% of GDP, 34% of GDP. It rose to 120%. That's what gave us a housing bubble. Now, at the same time, the initial explosion of irresponsible lending by the banking sector wasn't to households, it was to speculative businesses. And business debt went from 36% of GDP, as you can see there, up to almost 80% of GDP. And then there was a stock market crash. Now, that crash caused share prices to fall 25% in one day. It was a larger crash than anything that happened back in Wall Street at the same time, a larger crash than happened even in Wall Street during the Great Depression. So at that point, banks could no longer encourage the business sector to take on more debt. And you can see that business debt fluctuated around up and down in various cycles. Business debt is about 60% of GDP, and there's no trend. Now, I thought after the experience of the stock market crash in 1987 that banks would be chastened for a while and there wouldn't be any particular growth in lending. I was wrong, because you can see it here in the data. As soon as they could no longer lend to the business sector, they started lending to households. And this is when the household bubble took off. So way back in the 1980s, household debt was about 40% of GDP. It rose to more than 120%. And that's what gave us the housing bubble. The lending by banks to households created money which didn't inflate the real economy, it inflated asset prices. And this again is a mechanism that escapes mainstream economists because they pretend that credit doesn't matter. But the mechanism is actually quite simple, and that is that supply of housing is obviously very rigid. Houses are much harder to construct than making ordinary consumer goods, so you can effectively treat the supply of housing as fixed. That means the demand is the main thing that is going to determine change in prices. Now, where does the demand come from? Because you have to borrow money to buy a house, the main source of demand for new housing is an increase in mortgage debt. So there's a relationship between new mortgage debt and the level of house prices. There is therefore a relationship between change in new mortgage debt and the rate of change of house prices. If it's new mortgages that are determining the level of house prices, therefore the change in mortgage debt sets the level of house prices. The change in mortgage debt sets the rate of change of house prices. And you can see how tightly these two fit together. The correlation is ridiculous over a 45-year period to get a correlation that high. This is how we've got trapped. So we've got to get out of that trap. What are possible ways to do that? One is to establish an affordable housing authority that lends to people who are below the average wage or below the median, let's say, who simply can't afford to get into the market right now. If you look at the level of lending, it's completely disconnected from incomes. There was a 4 to 1 or 4.5 to 1 ratio between house prices and incomes then. There's a 12 to 1 ratio now. We can't allow that to continue. We've got to bring it down. So one way would be to regulate the banks to say that they can lend no more than a multiple of the rental income of the property being purchased. And a third issue is the level of private debt. So this is now looking at the level of government debt. And obviously this is the thing which around the world politicians are obsessing about. The Australian government's actually got quite a low level of debt. It was down to 10% of GDP. It's now up to about 50% of GDP. And that's what politicians obsess about. So obviously if that's what they're obsessing about, private debt must be smaller. Let's find out. There's government debt and there's private. Private debt is far higher than government debt, and this is the rule for most developed economies around the world. Private debt is far larger than government debt. Politicians are obsessing about this one. This is the one that matters. We have to tame the banking sector, and that's where my 3 proposals come in. And I'll talk about all 3 of those policies in detail in the next video.
Like many other truth seekers, I want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks. You'll have my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to stevekeen.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to stevekeen.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.